Hello, I'm Chris Troop, and this is my Ben talk on Franz Kafka and the research I did with Jean-Michel Rabate. So, by way of a structure, I'm going to split this talk into three parts. Firstly, we're going to talk about the preconceptions surrounding Franz Kafka and his work and how they prejudice how we read Kafka. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how these preconceptions were examined by myself and Jean-Michel Rabate, the extent to which they were true, and how we moved forward with or without them. And then thirdly, I'm going to give an example of the kind of close reading and analysis I did throughout this research project, so as to give a kind of insight into the conclusions we made and kind of how we drew them. So, whenever Kafka's referenced in any context, he's accompanied by an entire set of preconceptions and prejudices about his life and his work, and all of them are just assumed to be true. The story goes along the lines of that Kafka was a predominantly tragic figure, sort of secluded to his basement due to a mixture of debilitating neuroticism, poor physical health, and all the while afflicted by an intense resentment of his father, his job as a clerk, the Jewish society he was born into, and rather than being overcome with despair, he turned to writing as a means of therapy, and monk-like piously dedicated himself towards his craft until eventually dying of tuberculosis, having never married. So this kind of really tragic backstory highly informs how we read Kafka. It highly prejudices it. If you take any of his famous works, such as The Trial, The Castle, Metamorphosis, each, when read in the same way, can be characterized as a sort of desperate search for meaning, at the end of which he's presented with a box, and he opens the box to find the sort of meaning of life, and it's empty, totally devoid of meaning. And due to this, he's somewhat lazily pigeonholed alongside other modernist authors who are obsessed with this kind of absence of God, essentially. Say a T.S. Eliot, for example. And this quasi-myth, and we will call it a myth, created around Kafka can be traced back to a single man, Max Brod, Kafka's friend in later life, and subsequently his editor, and most crucially his biographer. So Max Brod wrote the defining biography on Kafka, and this was highly informed by the Kafka that he knew, who was bedridden and was a little bit older and was a little bit more dark in his inclinations to think, which fell in line with Brod's kind of simplistic and more pessimistic, humorless reading of Kafka's work. So out of this emerges a really reductive view of Kafka, which is only conveniently coherent to align with kind of Brod's reading. And I think this is a real shame because it utterly neglects one of Kafka's most compelling and attractive qualities as a literary figure, which is his humor. Kafka is actually very funny. And this is the main thrust of my research with Jean-Michel Rabate, was to sort of tease out these punchlines, to figure out how we can get rid of these preconceptions of Kafka and view Kafka as a much more complete and interesting author. So our first point of call is to basically examine our prejudices towards Kafka the person. So upon reading his letters and accounts of his life as a young man in Prague, one doesn't have to dig particularly deep to find accounts of a generally very funny, socially adept, even gregarious man who went out and did all the normal things a young man would do in Prague. He went dancing, he went socializing, he went drinking, he laughed a lot with his friends, and he kind of enjoyed his job. So immediately this adds a lot more depth to Kafka as a man, that while he was capable of these moments of extreme agony and despair and darkness, he also had a flourishing and normal social life and was very, very funny according to most of his friends. This kind of debunks the myth of the literary recluse that we're given in the Brod account. And so fresh from these preconceptions, it was my task to reread a lot of Kafka's work, comb through it all, and essentially see the funny side. And what began to emerge was a totally new dimension to his work that I hadn't really considered before. So instead of these long, painful tales of existential despair, which are almost torturous if you view them in the first way, his works become a lot more dynamic. Before this rereading, I hadn't noticed the sheer banality and absurdism that Kafka wields to great effect. Even his stories are structured like a joke. The kind of building of great tension, the mounting of ridiculous circumstances, only to be met with this extremely dry and banal punchline at the end. His writing is still dark and difficult at times, but this added dimension adds a really redeeming quality to his work, that instead of kind of assigning everything with a uniform meaninglessness, we can laugh at our own meaninglessness, and that's essentially productive. Unfortunately, Brode's reductive influence isn't confined just to our conception of Kafka as a person through his biography, but spills over into the text himself, as Kafka's editor. And while it's still unclear as to how many texts Brode did tamper with, one of the most egregious examples of his tinkering to suit his own reading is in the short story of Prometheus, part of a series of myths and parables that Kafka threw his own spin on. So on the screen now you should see Brode's edited version, and I'd like to draw attention in particular to the final lines, which I'm going to read. There remains the inexplicable mass of rock. The legend tried to explain the inexplicable. As it comes out of the substratum of truth, it had in turn to end in the inexplicable. This can be easily read as an argument towards the redemptive quality of myth. That in our world, which is totally devoid of meaning and filled with bureaucracy and a lack of presence, imbuing this enormous rock with all these different kinds of myth existing kind of between truth and untruth, imbues a sense of presence and meaning towards something, thus making our lives more worth living. And within the context of Kafka's life, it's towards the end of his life. This can easily, again, be read as Kafka's concession to the search for meaning through myth, basically blessing myth as the way in which we search for meaning now in this world, kind of a la T.S. Eliot, who does a very similar thing with a lot of his references throughout The Wasteland. However, Kafka's original text is much punchier and much funnier. So, as you'll see now, this is Kafka's unedited text, and the final line is simply, "There remains an inexplicable mass of rock." This is very funny. There are 4 extremely grandiose explanations as to how this enormous rock came to be and whether it was Prometheus or not, but that doesn't really matter, because it's just an enormous rock. In this way, Kafka allows us to laugh at our own desperate search for meaning. We can laugh at the idea that we imbue all these different qualities to this enormous rock, where it is simply just a massive rock in the middle of the desert. It is very funny, and it's interesting how just the changing of one line alters the course of this entire parable. By way of a parting message, I'm going to leave you with Kafka's favorite joke, and it goes something like, "Leaving the opera, a refined and well-dressed lady is stopped by a beggar who asks for change. He says, 'Dear lady, I haven't eaten for 3 days.' She considers him thoughtfully and replies, 'Well, young man, you'll have to force yourself.'" Thank you very much for listening to my Ben talk, and I hope that I have been able to show some of the more redemptive qualities of Kafka's work through a abandoning of preconceptions. Thank you very much.